from Matthew 5, verses 1 through 16, and it is found on page 661 in your pew Bibles. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven."
Good morning. Great to see you guys here today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Corey. I am the pastor here at Waite Park Church, and we are going to have what is kind of, family discussion or an in-house discussion, and because we want to talk a little bit about what we want to be when we grow up. As a church. And the point of this is not to, like if you're new or you're a visitor or whatever, it's not to exclude you, but actually it might be a good thing for you, because you'll get to get a good picture, a good idea of what we want to be, the kind of church we want to be, the kind of people that we're trying to create. You're going to get kind of a sneak peek behind the curtain of what we're trying to do, and if you're a believer, then you'll get an idea also of, I think, what God calls all of us to do as believers. And so it might be something very helpful for you. We're not necessarily going to focus on who we are right now. And some of it will. I mean, I think we're already accomplishing some of what I'm going to talk about. But also, we're not there yet. We're not quite there yet. We still have a long way to go, and I'm guessing that probably 5 years from now, I'll still consider that we have a long way to go in becoming what God wants us to be. Now, one of the things that we believe is that the church was not just some guy's idea. Okay, it was God's idea. And given some of our failures, I can't always figure out whether it was a good idea or not. But that's how it is. I mean, that's just the reality that we're stuck with, that the church was God's idea, and we're a part of this church. And despite the fact that certainly the church has done a lot of terrible things throughout the course of history, I don't want to minimize that. But we also have to tell the whole story. The church has actually accomplished some pretty amazing things in its 2,000 years of existence as well. So for instance, how many hospitals and schools, colleges and universities have been founded by the church, seeing the need for the furthering of education and the church stepping up and meeting that need? How many orphanages were founded, certainly back in other days, but now adoption services and people adopting children, millions of children whose lives have been changed because people know that their job, or Christians know that their job is to work for the glory of God and for the sake of the world. Christians have always been on the forefront of confronting injustice. They were very instrumental in ending slavery in England and in the United States. They've been very, very instrumental in the American Civil Rights Movement. Wherever there's a disaster, anywhere in the world, the first organizations on the scene almost invariably are Christian organizations. Evangelical Christians, for all of the bad rap that they get are still the most generous people in the world. Studies show that they are more giving of their finances than any other group in the world. Countless sick people have been nursed back to health or fed because Christians believed that God has given us a responsibility to care for the world. And so we have to remember those things, remember the things that the church has accomplished in 2,000 years, and it's always as a result of being the kind of people that God called us to be. In fact, certainly it's popular these days to talk about all the bad things the church has done. It's kind of in vogue. But at the same time, you also have to recognize that when the church does those things, it is acting out of character. Because the truth of the matter is I'm not sure that anyone can look at this passage that we read today from Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and come up with the idea for the Crusades. Okay? So when you read something like that, what you find is that the Crusades and the Inquisition and Salem witch trials are things when Christians are acting out of character with what Christ called us to be. And so as a church, we are called to... in fact, I think as a church here, we're going to be obsessed with this over the next couple of years, and maybe even beyond that, with living out the story that God has called us to. And that's what Jesus meant when he said in this passage, he said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Great metaphor there. What does it mean? Well, I think we have some idea about what salt is good for. Of course, in Jesus' day, the most important thing that salt was good for was it was a preservative. They didn't have refrigeration and freezers. And so what they would do is if they would get a big chunk of meat, and really, if you were killing a cow or a large animal, that's all you could get is a big chunk of meat. And so they would just cover it with salt, and salt would act as a preservative. And Jesus says that this is one of the roles that the church is to play. It's not to be divisive in the world, but actually to through our relationships and even the structures that we create, to act as a preservative in the world. Now, the second thing that we know salt is good for is something that we use it more for. Now that we have refrigerators and freezers, we don't need it as a preservative, and so what we use it for is to bring out the best in food. Now, it's been a while since I've made my plug here, and I still think I should get paid for this, but if you haven't been to Pizzeria Lola before, you need to make sure that you go there sometime. In fact, if you've never been there, go there after church. Just get up and, not right now, stay here for now, but when I'm done, then go to Pizzeria Lola. It's in South Minneapolis off the Crosstown and Xerxes Avenue, I think it's on, a little neighborhood there. And it's great. It's a wood fire pizza place, and they have some great, really unique sort of things. They put things on pizza that you wouldn't expect people to put on pizza, and it works, and it's really good. But for my money, and maybe you guys know this, for my money, the best thing there is the chocolate chip cookies. All right, pizza place, chocolate chip cookies. They have this thing called the DIY ice cream sandwich. That's do it yourself. And so what they do is they give you a couple of chocolate chip cookies and they give you a dish of vanilla ice cream. And what I would recommend is not trying to put the ice cream inside the cookies and eat it like that, because it makes a mess. All right? But just take your spoon, take a cookie, put some ice cream on it, and take a bite, and it'll be like paradise for you. I'm telling you. I'm a fan of chocolate chip cookies. My wife always asks me around Christmas time, what Christmas cookies should I make? And I always say chocolate chip. And she says, they're not Christmas cookies. She said, and I just say, you asked me what kind of cookies I wanted, and I want chocolate chip cookies. And so she always begrudgingly makes me chocolate chip cookies at Christmas time. But I've been wondering, I've been trying to think of why those cookies are so good, because I love chocolate chip cookies, but these are like a step up from regular chocolate chip cookies. And at first I kind of wondered why, and then I realized that they have a secret ingredient. It's that on top of the cookie is actually sprinkled some sea salt, okay? Which sounds crazy, it sounds weird, but there's something about putting sea salt on these cookies that make them go from good to great. All right? I mean, they are just like melt in your mouth, the best thing you've ever had. I hope it's not a disappointment when you go now, but because I've really built these things up. But for me, it's like heaven, It makes a good cookie suddenly amazing. And it's just by virtue of adding salt. Now, the salt doesn't really add a flavor of its own. What it does is it brings out the flavors that are already there. In fact, salt by itself is kind of terrible. Have you noticed that? Or if you have too much of it and it sort of dominates, like have you ever accidentally put salt on your cereal instead of sugar? I did that once. It was awful. Also, I grew up in a farm, or on a farm, in a farming community, on a farm as well, in South Dakota. And so when I was growing up, there were always, by the exits of the grocery stores, salt blocks. Okay, do you guys, was that ever the case for you guys? Do you remember that? Okay, I don't know why, but cows love salt blocks. I'm not sure what I don't know why it is, but I always walked by these things when I was a little kid, and I think one day I was walking by them, and I thought, well, if they're good enough for cows, they're probably good enough for me too, and so I decided that I was going to try it out. Like, what do the cows see in these salt blocks? And so I licked one, and I got to tell you, it was terrible. It was like one of the worst things I've ever tasted in the world. Now, maybe there were other things in it, probably some chemicals or something like that, but it was mostly salt. But the salt by itself was terrible because it was bitter. And so here's the thing that I realized about salt, is that salt really only realizes its value when it comes into contact with something else. Okay? Now remember, Jesus is making a metaphor here. And so if you extend it out, here's what he's saying, is that the church really only reveals its value when it comes into contact with the world. The church by itself is oftentimes can become very bitter. If you've ever been a part of a church that didn't reach out, that just stayed sort of cloistered and considered themselves to be a family, but didn't reach out, what you find is that oftentimes there's a lot of infighting. There's a lot of competing for people getting what they want in the church. And so I think the analogy of the church being salt in the world holds that when we keep to ourselves, we end up being very bitter. But the church reveals its value when we come into contact with the world. And Jesus' point there is that the church will only fulfill the calling that we have when we remember who we are and what we were created to do. But it's when we try to mimic the world and try to do things like the world that we lose ourselves and we end up in trouble. Okay? How does it usually work when the church gets involved in power politics? Okay? When we try to do things the way the world does, that's when we end up in trouble. But when we remember who we are, when we remember our story, then the church starts to add value and reveals its value when we come into contact with the world. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this series, and I think probably a couple times in between as well, that our church board, our leadership, has been rethinking how we do outreach. And we've actually spent quite a bit of time on it this year, and those of you who are on the board are probably nodding your head. You're ready to move on to something else. But we've been thinking about it, and we've thought, over the last few years, we've done some pretty good things. We've partnered with some ministries. We've done a few events ourselves. National Night Out is one that we've been doing since before I came here, and it's a great opportunity for us to engage with our neighbors. We do the oil change day in the fall. We have Bike Day coming up. We haven't made an announcement about it yet, but that's another opportunity that we have to engage with our neighbors, and those are good things, and we'll continue to do those. But I believe that as a church, we can do better. And that's why we're talking about this. We've actually been considering different organizations that we can partner with in order to allow us or give us the opportunity to serve, but we want to be able to do it in a distinctively Christian way. We want to be able to serve in ways that don't just feed stomachs, but feed souls. And so we're considering some options. We set up a list of criterion for organizations that we want to bring in here. And then after Easter sometime, I don't know if it'll be late April, but starting in May sometime, we're going to bring in probably 3 or 4 organizations to sort of make a presentation to us and talk about their ministries. And then we're going to get together and we're going to have some forums where we'll kind of talk about it and give you a chance to voice your opinion and to say, well, this one really resonated with me. This is something that I think that we could accomplish. And then through that process, we're going to choose 1 or 2 organizations to really dive into, and we're going to focus our outreach efforts in those areas. And so we want to make sure that you guys are a part of that process, because we want to, once we partner with an organization, we want to do it so that we're making an impact in a particular area and we can see things happen. And not only that, but we can do so in a distinctively Christian way, in a way that you guys are able to share the gospel, that you guys are able to disciple people, that you're coming into relationship with unbelievers. And this will be really helpful for us. And the good thing about partnering with organizations is that they're already doing it and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so the good thing about that is it'll give us opportunities to serve. But as we've been talking as a board, we've also come to realize that actually this in itself is not going to do it. Because if we just see ourselves as people who are just, we have to serve because it's a sideline, we're waiting to go to heaven, and so it's something that we can do while we're here, then that's not good enough. Okay, because actually we need to develop a heart for it as a church. We need to understand that this is the very reason that we were created to exist. This is the reason the church is here. Ephesians 2:10, and I've mentioned this before, it says, "We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." It doesn't say, oh, now that you're saved, if you want something to do, go ahead and go serve someone. No, it says this is the very reason that the church is in existence, to go out and to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do, and we want to do that in a way that is distinctively Christian. You see, the church is really serving its purpose when lives are being transformed by the grace of Jesus, because that's really the only thing that the church has that no other group in the world can offer. And so when we as a church reach out, that's the thing that we have to offer. It's great to go out and serve, and as humans, it's our job to get out there and to make the world a better place. But as Christians, our calling is to something even more than that, and that is to glorify God and promote Jesus, proclaim the message of Jesus for the sake of the world. Now, we are part of a long story, and we've talked about that story over the first few weeks. If you missed the first few weeks of the series, go back and listen to it. We start all the way back in the garden with Adam and Eve, and then we kind of move on from there. We're part of this long story from Adam and Eve to Abraham to Moses to the people of Israel, and then ultimately to Jesus. And we're the continuation of that story that tells us who we are. It tells us what business we're in and how we're supposed to carry that out. And so what I want to do today in the time that we have left is I want to talk practically about what this means for us as a church. In other words, I want to talk about what kind of a culture we're trying to create, what kind of people that we're calling ourselves to be. And I want to do it by looking at the story and sort of placing ourselves in that story, looking at some of the characteristics that God shows us in that story and say, well, this is how this translates to us on a practical level. And as I do this, I want you to see the kind of culture that we're trying to develop in this church and to become the kind of people that we are called to be. And like I said earlier, we're not there yet, but we're working toward it. I think there are many good things that are happening here, but I think that we still have a long way to go. So let's start looking at the story, and you'll see what I mean. First of all, at the very beginning, the biblical story tells us that humans are made in God's image. Now, of course, that means something for us as believers, okay? We talked about the fact that one of the aspects of being made in the image of God is that we have a vocation, that He created us in order to order and to rule the world in a way that honors Him. And of course, that's our job as believers. We believe that. That's actually our human vocation. And so we're called to do that. And I think as a church, we're called to do that also as Christians, but to take it even a step further and to proclaim the kingdom, to proclaim Jesus. And so what that means for us is that we have a job to do. But it also means not something just for us, but it means something for the people who are outside the church, and it's this. Is that not only are we created in the image of God, but every single person that you come into contact with on a daily basis is also made in the image of God, and because of that has incalculable worth. Now imagine how much different your life would be if you really believed that. Okay? Here's how C.S. Lewis says it. He says, "There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Now think about that for a minute. Your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. So what does that mean? It means that the CEO of the Fortune 500 company and the drug addict have the same worth before God. It means that the President of the United States and the Syrian refugee, they have the same value before God. It means saint or sinner, prostitute or missionary are all equally made in the image of God. And if you believe this, then it should transform how you look at people. How you see the guy who's walking down Central Avenue or the lady with the shopping cart that you see. And it's easy for Christians to skip this step and to jump right into all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's no one righteous, no, not one. It's easy for us to skip this first part and go right to this part about being sinners, but that's not where the biblical story begins. If you don't believe that every person is an image bearer, then you'll treat some people well, and some people you'll ignore, and others you'll treat badly. Or you'll only love those who love you or have something to offer you. But when we understand that every single person that you meet is made in the image of God, whether or not they display that, and we'll talk about that later, if you don't understand that every single person is made in the image of God, then our starting place is wrong. Okay? And so we need to, everyone that we meet, remember that. That's why I'm not a big fan of culture war language, because every war has enemies, and we believe, and if we believe that we're in a war against people, then we will start to treat them like enemies. But we follow a guy who said, even those people who think that you're their enemy, pray for them, love them. This is the guy that we follow, okay? This is the God that we follow. And they're people made in the image of God, and so even when they're not reflecting that, we should always see the potential in them and remember their value. I had lunch with one of our new people here today. Said he grew up nominally Catholic, but over the years, and I think for him it was because of the priest sexual abuse scandals and all that, he became an agnostic and considered himself to be an agnostic for many, many years. And so I was talking to him, and he's a believer today, and I was talking to him, and I asked him, I said, so what was it that sort of turned you on to Jesus? What got you in touch with Jesus? And he said, well, I met a group of Christians who were the most humble and sincere and the kindest people that I'd ever met. And I looked at Christianity, and I noticed that they were living out exactly what it was. They didn't see me as their enemy. They didn't, try to push me away, but they embraced me, and they loved me, and they cared for me. And to me, that was the most attractive thing in the world, and it was because of them that I became a Christian. Now, I wonder if these people, these Christians that he met, if they had been thinking about a culture war or seeing him because he was an agnostic as an enemy, I wonder how much different his story would turn out. But because they were salt, because they lived out what Christ called them to live out, and they lived consistently with the story, and they saw the value in him, then he was able to come to Jesus and to know him. Now, when you recognize the first part of that story, that everyone is made in the image of God, then you can move on to that next part, that we all fall short of the glory of God. And this means a couple of things for us. There are two sides to it. The first thing is that we should never be surprised when people don't behave the way we think they should behave. Okay? In a sense, what I'm saying is that we have to be comfortable being around sin. Okay? I know that maybe that doesn't sound good to a lot of you. I'm not saying we should be comfortable sinning, okay? But we should be comfortable being around sin. And what that means is that if we're so sensitive to other people's sin that we can't be around them, then it will be impossible for us to be in a place where we can effectively share the gospel. And if we expect people to get cleaned up and to act the right way and clean up their language, or else we'll be offended, then pretty soon we'll just find ourselves hanging out with each other. And that's pretty much it. And what we find in the New Testament is that Jesus spent most of his time with those people, right? The ones that oftentimes the church calls those people, the tax collectors who are basically, legally extorting money from people. the prostitutes, the generic, what the Bible calls the generic sinners of society. Those are the people that he hung out with. And I don't think he was plugging his nose the whole time. Because I think he was able to see past their behavior. He was able to see past their behavior into their value, into what they actually were, the potential of what they could become. And I think as believers, that's obviously a model for us. But there's another side to this as well, and that is, it comes with that little word, and I was talking about Romans 3:23, where it says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's that one little word in there that's kind of a troublesome word, that word all, right? Because if it's true that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that also includes us. Okay? And so what I would say there is that everybody outside the church knows you're not perfect, and I know you're not perfect, and you know you're not perfect, so let's just stop pretending. Gary Steele had told me this story. He's actually probably a number of times. But Gary is very community-minded. He likes to get out there, and I think this was probably, I don't know, it was a number of years ago, I suppose. Gary went into the fire station and knows a lot of the firefighters, and he said he went in there one day, and they started talking, and they were using some pretty coarse language, swearing and all that, and they were just, having a fun time like a lot of men do. I'm not going to excuse that, but okay, this is what they're doing. And so Gary, just kind of wanting to feel a part of the group, started sort of joining in and using the same language and yucking it up with them and all that. And I don't know, what it's like to be in a group of people who are acting a certain way, and you don't want to feel left out, and this is the way Gary was feeling. And so he, was kind of using language with them and all that. And so they got done with their conversation. He was driving away, and he started to feel convicted about it. And so he decided that he was going to turn around and go back to the fire station. And that's what he did. He turned around, went back to the fire station, and went to the guys, and he said, hey, listen, guys, I just want you to know, I need to apologize to you guys. Because I came in here, and you guys were, talking and swearing and all that, and I joined in with you and used some words that I don't usually use. And the reason I'm apologizing is because I'm a Christian, and that was out of character for me, and I just need to apologize to you guys for that. That's not the kind of person that I want to be. And of course, how did they respond? They ridiculed him, right? And they started calling him Reverend and all of that stuff. But it was kind of there was sort of a camaraderie that developed there, And I think what you could see happen there, is that they respected him greatly for it, because he didn't walk away and pretend that he didn't, or he just had a bad day, or make excuses for it and all that. He was able to go up to them and admit what he did, and even when they didn't agree that they didn't even think that he was doing anything wrong. And yet he was willing to go up to them and say, man, I'm sorry, I was acting out of character there, and I just need you guys to forgive me. And I tell you what, it's that kind of humility that is incredibly attractive to the world. And I'm telling you, that kind of witness to the world will be way more effective than if we pretend that we're perfect, that we try to model. I think we should. In fact, I hope that Christians, I hope that we behave better than the rest of the world, but I hope that we're also able to admit it when we mess up. As Christians, we're not slaves to sin, but every once in a while we find ourselves slipping up. And if we're not willing to admit that to people, then they won't think that we're anything like them, that we can't relate to them. I'm not saying slip up on purpose. Okay? But I think we have to have the humility to admit that verse, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, applies to all of us. And it's a great witness to the world when I can just stop and I can say, hey, you know what? I blew it. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And of course, part of that story is that because we sin and fall short of the glory of God, that the world is messed up because of it. And we see the results of it all the time. We see the results of sin. There's suffering all over. We had a whole message on suffering and handling suffering last week. But sin causes that kind of suffering. But then we get to the third movement of the story, and it's this, is that God decided to do something about it. And so the third movement is that Jesus is the solution to sin and suffering. Jesus is the solution to sin and suffering. And you might say, well, duh, of course we believe that. We're Christians. This is like the basis of our faith. And my question to you is do we really? Here's what I mean. See, we have to remember that we are not the good news. We have to remember that we are not the solution to sin and suffering. And I think sometimes we get that mixed up, especially when we try to do our outreach. As Jesus continued teaching in Matthew chapter 5, he didn't tell us that to do our good deeds in order to solve all of the world's problems. He didn't say, let your light shine before men that you can solve world hunger. He didn't say that. Now, again, as part of our human vocation, I think we should work toward things like that, toward ending suffering and all that. He didn't say, do your good deeds to solve the world's problems. But as Christians, we have a specific vocation. This is what Jesus says. He said, let your light shine before people, that they may see your good deeds and do what? And glorify your Father in heaven. See, we can accomplish some really good things in the world, but ultimately, whatever we do as believers is intended always to point to Jesus as the solution. We're not the solution. Jesus is the solution. And too often, we focus so much on what we can accomplish through serving than we do on the power of Jesus Christ to change people's lives, to transform them into something that they are not now. And it's God that does that work. And if we spend our time trying to solve people's problems, then we might just be distracting them from the answer that they really need. I was talking with a friend on Friday who told me the story of a girl that he knows who grew up in church, but growing up in church was not a good experience for her. She had a church or parents that were overly strict, and so she felt crushed by the weight of all the expectations on her. And so when she graduated from high school, she decided that she was going to move out and experience everything that the world had to offer. And so she did that and had done it for a few years. And she tells a story that she was at work one day, and it was at a point when, she describes it this way, that her life was circling the drain of faith. In other words, that her faith was, just ready to be just about completely gone. And her life was in a pretty bad place. And so at work, she was talking to a coworker about how badly her life was going. And her coworker listened for a while and then didn't offer any advice, but just asked her this, "Can I pray for you?" That's all she said. And so she reluctantly agreed, and this woman started to pray for her. And the girl said that something happened inside of her at that moment. And she doesn't really know what it was, but there was something that started to change. She didn't know if she was just really impressed that this woman, would, in a secular workplace, would pray for her right then and there, or that there was something else going on. There was probably something else going on there. And she said that next Sunday she went back to church for the first time in years, gave her heart to the Lord, and everything changed for her at that point. Now, when I think about that story, I can't help but wonder, what if this coworker who was a Christian decided that it was more important for her to give her advice on her life than it was to seek the help and the power of the Lord in that moment? How much different would her life be today? I mean, I don't know, maybe it would be the same. Maybe she would have suggested that she go to church anyway, and it would have worked out the same. But it was so impressive that this woman's faith allowed her not to see herself as the solution, but to see Jesus as the solution. There was no sermon. She didn't share the 4 spiritual laws or anything like that. She just prayed for her, and the Holy Spirit worked in her life. And I don't want you ever to forget that you don't change lives. Jesus changes lives. And he has the power to work in ways that you don't even realize. When God wanted to save humanity once and for all, he didn't pile on law after law after law. That happened in the Old Testament and it didn't work. But what he did was he sent Jesus to do the work that we could not do. To make a way for our forgiveness, to heal us, to make us new. And so the question is, do you believe that story? And I come back to that question. It's easy for us to say, well, of course I'm a Christian. Of course I believe that story. But do you really? That it's Christ who transforms lives, not us. And we can go out and serve and all that, but really the point of our serving is to give testimony to the one who can actually solve the issues that we deal with. So do you really believe that Jesus is the solution to sin and to suffering? Do you believe that Jesus can even make the worst of sinners brand new? And if we really do as individuals and as a church, then it will absolutely impact the way we reach out in the world. This is the reason I think that prayer is so essential to the work that we do. I know over the last couple of weeks throughout Lent, we're fasting and praying on Fridays, and what we've asked you to do is to fast and pray that God would break your heart for the lost, that he would show you someone to invite to Easter service. So, maybe they'll hear the gospel for the first time or for the first time in a long time. And the reason we're having you fast and pray for that is not just because it sounds good. Okay? The reason is because we do believe that God works through that God is working and changing people's heart and changing your heart as well. And so allow the power of God to work in your life. Spend time in prayer and understand that that's the most important work that you have to do, because Jesus is doing more important work than you've ever had to do. Fourth part of the story, and there's so much more to it, but we don't have time to go into all of it. But this is one that I want to highlight, and it's just this, is that Christ created a new family. Christ created a new family. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but we tend to believe, and I think because we're Americans, because we're Westerners, we tend to think of faith in a very individualistic sort of way, that Jesus died in order to save me from my sins so I can go to heaven when I die. But one of the things that many of you know that I went to Sierra Leone and I taught a class on the Pauline epistles when I went there, and I did a lot of studying, a lot of brushing up on the Pauline epistles, just read all kinds of stuff and read through them. And one of the things that really struck me as I was reading through them, and I would encourage you to do this sometime, is I started to read them in a new way because of some stuff that I saw there. Okay? And I would encourage you to do this sometime. Sit down and read the letters of Paul sometime. Only rather than reading it individualistically, read it communally. Okay? Read it. And notice how many times Paul talks about what Christ did for us by creating a new family, by creating a new group of people. He talks so much about the Gentiles now being incorporated in with the Jews and God creating a new people together. Okay? Read it with those kind of eyes, and what you'll see, I think, is that not only did Jesus die for your personal sins, but he died to create this new community that we call the church. Christ died for that. And so when we say that the church is not our idea, but it's God's idea, for better or for worse, we tend to mess things up when we get our hands on it. Okay? But when we say that this was God's idea, then we really mean that. That's part of our story. That's who we are. And what this means for us is that as believers, we have to live into this story as well. And that means that we have to start living a little bit counterculturally. I have a real belief, and we were talking with some friends about this the other night. I really believe that in our culture, people have lost a lot of relational capacity. Just like you can get out of shape physically, and when you start running, then it's really painful and all that. I think we've become individuals for so long that we are out of shape when it comes to relationships. Ed Douglas was talking about when he was growing up, every Friday night or every Saturday night, he was a kid, and his parents would be at someone else's house, and they'd be playing cards, or what. He obviously wasn't a Wesleyan, but they'd be playing cards, or they would, whatever. They'd have dinner parties and all that kind of stuff, And he said, we've tried to do that kind of stuff, and everybody's always busy or doing something or whatever, and we don't know. And I just think that's very true, that we have neglected it for so long, that the gift that we have and the desire that we have for relationship, that we've just lost that capacity as people, both inside the church and outside the church. And I really believe that outside of Jesus, I think the number one asset that the church has to offer the world is a family, is the community of faith. But in order for us to be able to offer that to other people, we have to have it ourselves as well. That means that we have to build up our relational capacity, to not think about everything in individualistic terms, to not spend all of our time binge watching Netflix. Okay? This is what we do in our society. I mean, when you would go over to someone else's house, that was entertainment, because that was the entertainment that we otherwise we had 3 channels, and there was nothing good on at the time, except for Love Boat. Love Boat was on, and that was really good, right? But other than Love Boat, there was nothing else on TV. But you understand what I mean? That God created us for this. He created us for relationships, and so the church of all people in the world should do this the best. And that means that we have to, many of us, change the way we interact with each other, change the way we interact with the world, to start to get into shape, for a lot of people. I think even extroverts today, when they spend time with people, a lot of times it wears them out. And I just think that's because that's what our society has done. It's created a bunch of people that have very small relational capacity. But this is a way that we can meet a very desperate need in our society, of people both outside and inside the church. Okay, you look around this sanctuary, you're going to also find some lonely people. And that should not happen in the church. And so that's a culture that we want to create, where there are no people here who are alone. Well, there's so much more that I could say about living our story, but I think you get the idea. We have a calling to fulfill, and not just a calling that we have as humans, but a calling that we have as the people of God, the calling that we have as the church, and I think that's something that we need to own. Okay? In a sense, we're the same as everyone else because we're humans. We have that same sort of experience. But at the same time, we're called to be something a little bit different. And so we're going to be different. The culture of our church is going to be different than the culture of the world, I hope. The way you interact with people and treat people is going to be different than the way people in the world will. And I hope it's better. Because we are called to be salt, and if salt loses its saltiness, then how can it be made salty again? This is the teaching of Jesus. And so we want to be faithful to live out our calling and to do it in a way that is definitively and specifically Christian, to serve our neighbors, to trust that God is working in their lives and allow God to do the work that He has said that He would do. Let's pray. God, thanks for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the power of your Holy Spirit that works in our lives. And I think as we have this ongoing conversation as a church, I pray that you would capture us, not just the leaders as we talk about it at board meetings and email chains and all of that, but everyone who's a part of this church, that we would own our story, that we would understand that we were all created in God's image, that we would understand that we are all part of the fall, that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that you made a way for us in Jesus to not allow us to be slaves to sin anymore. And you've given us a purpose to fulfill in this community called the church. And so I pray that each one of us in here would take it on ourselves to start living into that culture, living into that story, and realizing that it's our responsibility not just to partner with organizations that will help us to be able to serve, but to just live that out in our day-to-day lives, to serve the people that we work with, to pray with them if they need it, to build community here so that no one here is lonely. God, make us into the people that you've called us to be so that we can fulfill the purpose that you've called us to fulfill. And may we always trust that you are the one working and transforming lives. We pray this in Jesus' name.